a retirement withdrawal strategy. It's actually been around for about a half a dozen years, but I just stumbled upon it and it really resonated with me, and I wanted to share that with you today. Today's video is actually live, which is a bit of an experiment, so we'll see how that goes. Hopefully it goes pretty well. But in any event, let's dive right into it. And the way I came about this, it actually is a spending strategy that was put out in a paper initially in 2017 from the Stanford Center on Longevity. It's been updated. It was updated in 2019. I'll show you all that on the screen in a minute. But I came about this kind of in a couple of different ways. The first is that, we talk a lot about different withdrawal strategies on the show. The 4% rule is perhaps the most well-known, but we've talked about Guyton Klinger, the ratcheting rule from Michael Kitces, different guardrails. And the thing that struck me, because I talk to a lot of people, I get a lot of emails from folks who are in retirement, and I don't think anybody follows all of the rules that we've talked about on this channel. I don't know of anyone that follows any of those rules religiously. And so that was sort of the first observation. And the second one was, how difficult it can be to actually follow them. I mean, we can look at history and say, well, the 4% rule worked, but it's really hard for people to just blindly take their inflation adjusted amount each year, even while maybe, I think last year, inflation was 9% and the market was down, including bonds, by whatever, 20%. I just, how practical is all of this? And so I was sort of thinking about those issues and then stumbled upon this this spending rule or withdrawal strategy, if you will, that I want to share with you. And frankly, it's something that if I'd looked at probably even 6 months ago, I probably would have thought, nah, that's not for me. I don't like it. But it really resonated with me. And I think it's actually a good place to start for a lot of folks. And I think it's actually consistent with the way a lot of retirees handle their money. So let's get right to it. This is the study. Again, I'll leave links to everything below the video after the live show is over. You can see it was published in November of 2017, including by Wade Pfau. He was one of the authors. And it walks through what they call the Spending Safely in Retirement Strategy. That's the name of it. These authors have since sort of updated it. This is actually an 82-page document. I'm not going to talk a lot about this document, but I will link to it below the video. The thing I like about this, among other things, is that it actually walks through some hypothetical retirees. Single retiree, married couple, middle income, more affluent. It walks through this spending safely in retirement strategy with some very specific examples. So I highly recommend that. And so with that, let's talk about what in the world is it? And this is one of the things I like about it. It's really simple. It only has two components. One of them deals with Social Security and how and when to start claiming Social Security. We'll talk about that. And then the other one is required minimum distribution. And that's it. It's that simple. Now, on the RMD side, we can have some initial potential objections like, well, wait a minute. They don't kick in until I'm 72, or I guess starting this year, 73? What if I retire before then? Or what if I have accounts that aren't subject to RMDs, like a Roth or a taxable? Trust me, those are easy issues to tackle, and we will do that. So that's it. Social Security and RMDs. Let's break them down. With Social Security, what the report said was, for a single individual, or if you're married, the primary wage earner, you want to delay taking Social Security until you're 70. And we'll talk about that because sometimes that's difficult depending on your circumstances, but delay until you're 70. And then if you're married, there's a secondary wage earner. They're typically going to start taking Social Security somewhere around full retirement age, but that can vary. Typically, though, they will start taking Social Security before they're 70. The report doesn't give a whole lot of guidance on how to calculate that. In that regard, I would just suggest a tool like New Retirement. This is a demo account, but they have a whole Social Security Explorer that you can follow. I've actually gone through this in a different video, and I'll link to all of that below this video as well. So that's the Social Security piece. Now, the report does say, look, for some folks, it's going to be hard to wait until you're 70 to start taking Social Security. course, you could work until you're 70, but not everyone can do that, or not everyone wants to do that. And so there were a couple of options. One was to come up with a sort of retirement transition or Social Security bridge fund to basically fund the, your spending from the point you retire until you reach 70, basically from savings, and to maybe set that money aside to do that if you can. Again, they recognize not everyone can do that either. And so the study, and I don't think this changed with the more recent version of it in 2019, said, well, look, the ideal is to wait until you're 70, but the world won't end if you take it sooner than that. But you want to delay as long as you can, at least till full retirement age, and even to 68 or 69 if you can. So that's sort of the basic, first element of this strategy. Delay until 70 if you can, or as late as possible, particularly if you're a primary wage earner. The secondary wage earner, you might take it a little bit earlier, and there are tools to help you figure that out. So that's part one. And there you go. Part two is required minimum distributions. Just take your RMD, and if you're most brokers will calculate this for you. Of course, we'll talk about what happens if you retire before you reach 72 or now 73. But once you are in your RMD phase, you've reached that age, this strategy couldn't be any easier. Social Security check comes in every month, gets deposited into your checking account. You can have your broker do the same thing with your RMDs. Obviously, you want to check with your broker to see what features they offer with required minimum distributions. But the ones I've looked at, like a Vanguard or a Fidelity or a Schwab, they offer these features. Some folks might just get it once a year. There are different options, but it couldn't be any easier. And before we get to the pros and cons of this strategy, though, we now have to talk about the RMDs if you retire before they kick in. And what if you have other accounts? Let's actually start with the other accounts, because many of you have Roth accounts, you have taxable accounts. To me, that's very simple to deal with, because you can just calculate your own RMD number. Yeah, it may take a few more steps than just having Fidelity send you your RMD each year or each quarter or whatever. You may have to actually do the math yourself and pull the money out yourself from a taxable account or a Roth account. But calculating the RMDs, and we're going to actually look at it here in a second, is really pretty simple. So that's kind of the easy one. I think the slightly harder, but frankly not difficult, question is, what if you retire before the RMDs kick in? For a lot of people, it's 72. The Secure 2.0 Act actually bumped it to 73 beginning this year, and it goes to 75, I think, in 2034 or 33, something like that. But what happens if you retire at 65? How do you calculate the RMDs? And that's what I want to show you next. So we're going to look at this document. This is from the IRS. I will link to it below this video. It's actually a very long document, and we're towards the bottom of it, where they have, as you can see, the different RMD tables. And what we're looking at here is table 3. This is the table that most retirees will use to calculate their required minimum distribution for whatever, their traditional IRA or their traditional 401k. Let me add myself to the screen a little bit if I don't get too much in the way. And so this is it. It's very simple. So if you were 72, you would take the balance of your traditional retirement accounts as of December 31 of last year, right? And you would just divide by 27.4, and that gets you your RMD. And just look up your age and pick your number. Couldn't be any easier. You do use a different table, by the way. Notice this says married owners whose spouses aren't more than 10 years younger. And you say, well, that's interesting. What if they are more than 10 years younger? Well, you use a different table. And here's the thing to know about this RMD table. These numbers, I used to think these were the life expectancy. If you're 72, you have a life expectancy of 27.4 years. And I did the math, and I'm like, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. Our life expectancy isn't 99 years. And that's true whether you're, regardless of your gender. And by the way, this is not gender specific. But it turns out that this is actually a joint life expectancy. It's the life expectancy of two people, one age 72 and their spouse aged 10 years younger, 62. And you get this joint life expectancy. That's actually what most RMD calculations are based on. Now, by the way, if you inherit an IRA as a non-spouse, it's a totally different table. And it's totally different rules. We're not talking about that in today's video. So, well, how do we figure out this number for, say, someone age 65 or 59 or whatever? Well, we can actually do that. It's not that difficult. And the table we need is the one right above it. This is actually the table you would use if your spouse is more than 10 years younger and the sole beneficiary of your IRAs. And so let's just make sure we're zeroed in. Let's try to find this number. So that would be someone 72 with the spouse age 62. So the spouse's age goes across the top here. So we need to keep scrolling until we get to 62. We're getting close. There we go. So there's 62. Now we need to find the IRA owner's age of 72. So here we go. So here's 72 right here. And we go over to 62. Yep, there it is. That same 27.4 number. There it is. So let's imagine we wanted to get the same number for someone who was 65. Well, we would want to find the 65 number, but we want the spouse number, again, 10 years younger. So let's see here. We're getting warmer. Here we go. So here's 65. And we go over to 55, and there it is, 33.9. That would be the equivalent if the table 3 that we were looking at, that uniform lifetime table, didn't stop at 72 but went younger, including, let's say, to 65. Well, this is the number it should have in that column. I'm reasonably confident of that, but certainly leave a comment if you have a different view. And so you can basically look up any age you want and then find a spouse age 10 years younger, and you'll get basically the same number that you would have down in this lifetime table right here. Now I know it's a long document if it included earlier younger ages, right? All right. So we can use those tables to look up the number for an RMD at basically whatever age you want. Now, one thing I want to caution you against, or just to remind you, some of these papers that I'm going to link to, like this one, has tables at the end with comparable numbers. But remember, the RMD tables change as life expectancies change. And in fact, there was a recent change to them. So the numbers you'll see in these documents, I believe, are a bit outdated. So you want to make sure you're using the IRS documentation. And again, I'll link to this below the video. But if you're going to want to calculate an earlier aged RMD, then you're going to want to make sure you get the right data. So there you go. You can calculate what the RMD would be for any age pretty easily. You can certainly apply the RMDs to any accounts you want. I mean, the math is basically the same. Obviously, with traditional IRAs and traditional 401ks and other retirement accounts, once you do hit the RMD age, you want to make sure you follow the rules and take out at a minimum what the RMD would require. By the way, you can always take out more, right? There's no rule against that. You just can't take out less or you get penalized. And by the way, you don't have to spend what you take out. You just have to get it out of the retirement account and into a taxable account. That's the rule, so that the government can get their taxes. All right. So a fairly simple, I think, probably one of the easiest to follow withdrawal strategies that we've talked about on this channel, but I want to kind of be specific as to the things I like about it. Yes, it's very easy to follow. So that's number one. But the other thing is the spending adjusts with the stock market, right? Because you're taking the RMD factor and you're applying it against the balance of your account, say, as of December 31 of the previous year. So in years when the market's up, great, you'll get a little more money than you otherwise would have. But if the market has a bad year like last year, you're going to take out less. Now, that does make what we take out, it varies it. We're not adjusting this for inflation. So there's variability. But I think it's pretty much how most retirees behave anyway. I know very few people. In fact, I don't know any retirees that say, I blindly take out a set amount of money and it doesn't matter what's going on in the world. The market could be crashing and inflation could be almost 10%. And I just blindly follow the 4% rule. I've yet to find someone that actually does that. So I think it's actually a positive that it adjusts with the market. But here's the thing. It only does that to a point. Yes, the RMDs adjust with the market, but of course, Social Security doesn't, right? Social Security doesn't care what's going on in the market. It simply adjusts every year by the rate of inflation, which means when we combine the two together, we have some income, Social Security, that's adjusted for inflation, and we have some income that is not. And it is adjusted a little bit as we get older each year, and the RMD factor changes a bit from year to year. But its biggest changes occur when the market goes up or goes down. And so when we combine those two together, yes, there is going to be some variability, no question about it. But I think it's probably the kind of variability that many retirees can live with very easily. And in fact, in that sense, it reminds me of the Yale spending model, which is named after the university and their endowment. Think about a college endowment that's going to last forever, right? They don't have a 30-year retirement. They want this endowment to last, in perpetuity. And they have to figure out they want to support research as much as they can this year without jeopardizing or penalizing future research. And so how do they do that? And I think Yale came up with this, which I think is why it's called the Yale spending rule. But they kind of did, in a way, what this Social Security and RMD strategy does. They have some of their spending that gets adjusted for inflation every year, and they have some of their spending that gets based on the value of their endowment from the previous year, again, based on how investments do. So it's very, very similar. By the way, one of the things you could consider doing to sort of flatten out the volatility a little bit with the RMDs would be, rather than to apply the RMD to the balance of your investments as of, say, December 31 of last year, you could average the value of your investments over the previous 3 years and apply the RMD factor to that average balance. Now, I want to caution you, in terms of the IRS, you got to make sure you hit the RMD minimums for your traditional retirement accounts to avoid the penalty. But remember, just because you take it out doesn't mean you have to spend it. And you could determine your spending based on an RMD factor applied to, say, an average of the previous 3 years of portfolio balances, which would have the effect of smoothing out the bumps in how much you spend each year. So just an idea. The third thing I really like about this strategy is you don't have to make an assumption as to how long you'll live. You don't have to say, well, I'll assume a 30-year retirement or a 40-year retirement. If you're going to use something like the 4% rule, you need to, right? Because the 4% rule was designed with a 30-year retirement in mind, and that may be a reasonable assumption for you. But if we assume a 40-year retirement, 4% rule doesn't work. The longer your retirement, you have to start adjusting that safe withdrawal rate, and it puts you in the predicament of trying to predict when you're going to die. And when you're 65 and you think, sure, I'll live to be 30 years, another 30 years, that's a reasonable assumption. That may not be a bad assumption at all. But when you're 97, reality sets in. And so with this spending strategy, you don't have to make any predictions as to when you'll die. It's just not how it works. Obviously, it doesn't work that way for Social Security. And the RMD tables go all the way to age 115. And so you don't have to make that what I think is a very difficult prediction. Now, there are a couple of downsides. I mentioned the one already. Your spending can fluctuate from year to year, at least the part that's based on the RMD, but we've talked about ways to address that. I think the bigger issue, and the last thing I want to talk about with regard to this spending strategy, is that with it, you'll tend to spend more money or have more money to spend later in your retirement than you will earlier in your retirement. Now, that's a big problem with just about any spending strategy. It's a real big problem with the 4% rule. Most of the time, when you look at the history of the 4% rule, you die with more money than you started with. I mean, that's just the math. It all kind of is a crapshoot depending on what the markets do when you retire and during your retirement, and what inflation is. And so you don't always end up with more money. That's why the 4% rule is what it is. If you retired in the late 60s, you barely made it to 30 years of retirement. But for many, many other years, if you'd retired, you'd have a lot more money at the end of 30 years. So this spending too little, let's say in the first decade or two of retirement, and having more money to spend later in life when, frankly, maybe your health doesn't allow you to enjoy it as much as you'd like, is a big problem. So what are the solutions? Well, I'm going to give you, I guess 5 of them. The last one, by the way, is probably my favorite, but the one I'd probably use. But we'll go through a couple. The one is single life expectancy. Remember, I told you the RMD is calculated based on a joint life expectancy. Well, you could just use a single life expectancy. And by the way, that's in this same document. We've got to scroll up above the tables we were looking at. Oh, here we go. Single life expectancy. Now, if we go to 72, you can see the factor is 17.2, significantly lower than what the RMD schedule would get. So this would cause you to pull out a lot more money at 72 than if you just took your RMD. By the way, a kind of similar approach in the second way to maybe deal with this issue of not spending enough early in retirement is to use the Boglehead's variable spending strategy. I've talked about that on the program. I had some sort of similar concerns with it, and that was that your spending can go up and down significantly, but the numbers it uses, and I'll leave links to all this below the video, are kind of similar to a single life expectancy, not identical, but they're kind of at that same level. And so rather than starting in probably the 3.5% range for your initial withdrawal, depending on exactly when you retire, you're more around the 4.5 to 5.5%. And so that will help you spend more early on, but you could, and I think it increases the likelihood that you'd have to really curtail your spending later in retirement. So again, it's really a question of what you think is best for you. The third strategy kind of accomplishes the same thing, but differently. It's called the modified RMD strategy. And I think I have a paper here. Yeah, here it is. Again, I'll link to this. This is from the Center for Retirement Research at Boston College, where they talk about basing wealth withdrawals on required minimum distributions. They actually find what they call to be the modified RMD approach to be the most optimal. They say it clobbers the 4% rule. You can read the paper for the details. How does it work? Well, you take your RMD, but before you do, you first withdraw dividends and interest. Whatever you earn that year in dividends and interest, take that out. And then with the remaining balance, calculate your RMD. Now, obviously, from IRS purposes, you got to make sure that the result is you're withdrawing at least the required minimum distribution, but you want to make sure. But it's spend the interest and dividends and then calculate the RMD based on what's left. I'm not a huge fan of this, in part because I'm kind of fearful that it will encourage retirees to put their investments in high yielding investments at the sacrifice, at the risk of reducing total return. And it also seems a bit arbitrary to me. So I'm not a huge fan of it, but I thought I'd share it with you so you guys can check it out to make whatever decisions you think are best for you. The fourth of 5 options would be to actually increase the required minimum distribution, not by dividends and interest, right? That's the modified RMD approach, but by some factor of, say, 1.25 or 1.5. This was actually a suggestion in this 2019 paper that we looked at briefly at the start of the video. And I'll link to it. And they look at some history and they run some simulations. And so this is an option to consider. But the option that I like the most is just to have a set aside. So, you say you want to spend more money in your first decade of retirement, for example. Well, why? Maybe you want to travel. Maybe you want to redo the kitchen. Maybe you want to buy a sports car or a boat, whatever it is. I would actually figure out what it is I want to spend my money on that's going to require me to spend more earlier in retirement, and figure out what that cost is going to be, and then set that money aside. I don't necessarily have to pull it out of the retirement account yet. Depends on when I'm going to spend it. I'd also have tax considerations before I made that decision. But I could certainly, at least in my own mind, separate it out and say, okay, this $50,000 or whatever the number is what I'm going to use for travel over the first 10 years, where I think my health will allow me to travel more, say in my 60s and 70s. Then I'll be able to travel in my 80s and 90s. And so it forces us to really think about how we want to spend our money, what we want to spend it on, and how much it will cost. And then figuring out where that money is going to come from. And even if we don't pull it from the account, we at least mentally make a note, okay, this money is separate. We're going to spend it on some special things. And from a spending plan perspective, we'll calculate our RMDs with what's remaining. Again, always keeping in mind that when we hit that 72 or 73 or whatever your RMD age is, when you get to that point in life that you hit the IRS minimums every year. So there you go. I really like this approach. Again, maybe it's not the final approach. Maybe you take from that and then you make some adjustments to fit your own plans and your own sort of way of thinking about things. But I do think a lot of retirees, in fact, a lot of retirees that I know, this is actually exactly what they do. They get their RMDs every year and spend it, and they spend their Social Security. So I think it's the kind of spending strategy, that folks might actually use. And with some modifications, I think it can probably fit most retirees. Well, there you go. Would love to hear your comments, not only about the subject of the video, but the fact that I'm doing this live, which I don't know, maybe for you guys doesn't really matter. But I think I'm going to do more of them. So I would like to hear what you think. You can leave those in the comments below. As always, I'll be happy to help you out any way I can. And until next time, remember, the best thing money can buy is financial freedom.